for some of you. All right. We have spent some time talking about your nervous system. Just in case you were like lost the last couple weeks, just bringing you back. Here's where we are. We're learning about the nervous system. So that's great. Today we're going to talk briefly, and I know you're going to say, hey, I already talked about structure. That was sort of what we would call fine structure, right? So we talked about cells, right, Jakia? We talked about the structure of neurons. They look like this. Exactly. That's exactly what they looked like, right? I'm sure you have a cell that looks like that. You've got like 1 trillion cells in your brain. One of them has to look like that, right? I mean, it's just chance. So we talked about sort of this fine structure. We'll call it maybe microscopic structure, whatever you want to call it. We're going to zoom out just a little bit today, and we're going to talk about sort of broader structure of the nervous system. Look, I'm going to be in a slightly different camp than some of the other folks who might have taught you this, or Casey or some of the other classes. I think largely this is going to be a waste of time, so we're going to go through it quickly, right? And the reason for that is we're going to talk about big things. We're going to say, wow, you've got a diencephalon. Casey, that is so amazing you have a diencephalon, right? But what does that do for you in the real world? Very little, right? Because there are parts of the diencephalon, the thalamus and the hypothalamus. And in fact, that doesn't even do you much good, because the hypothalamus itself is probably, I don't know, somewhere between 0 and 500 different brain nuclei, right? So they're all doing different things. It's like a collection of these. And so you should really know what small individual part of that, right? So I think a lot of this broader structure is really a historical perspective. I'm not going to say it's old people stuck in the past that keep teaching you this, but it's old people stuck in the past that keep teaching you this. I think you need to have a new way of thinking about this, and I don't think most folks today are really, because we've moved beyond that and we understand circuits and we understand there are different, even different types of cells within brain nuclei, and they're doing different things, right? And so we're really into this sort of very detailed subunit of a subunit thing. Now, Cameron, we don't want to go too far down this path, right, and get to where like every single cell that you have is different than every other cell, right? So we still want to be able to group things, so there's still some benefit to these larger groupings, and so we'll think about that when we need to. All right, let's see. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time on this. Most of you who have taken some kind of physiology course or basic biology course, you've covered this. We will use these words sometimes when we need to. In particular, we'll talk about different brain nuclei. We'll talk about, the dorsal, lateral, geniculate nucleus. Well, dorsal means it's on top. Lateral means it's out to the side. If this is the middle. Right? That's all it means. It's nothing to get too worked up about. If you're not familiar with these words, spend just a little bit of time with them and get familiar with those so you can kind of navigate your way around just a little bit. Hey, sometimes you get an urge to cut a brain, and it just happens. So try to take care of that in the most appropriate manner that you can. When you do this, we need to think about how we're going to cut this, right? There are different ways you can do it. This is what we would call like a coronal section. You guys have probably heard that. Horizontal, just cutting horizontally. Sagittal or mid-sagittal, we're going to cut down. Sometimes you'll even hear the word parasagittal. I don't know, there's some debate about whether mid-sagittal is really a thing. Casey, maybe sagittal means right down the middle, and parasagittal is anything that runs parallel to that. So that's something. We already talked central and peripheral nervous system. You guys already know this, right? Not a problem. Here you go once again, central peripheral nervous system. Just for review, this is if you're going to slice that brain. This is obviously a human brain, for those of you that weren't aware of that. And just shows you the different ways you might want to slice a brain, so you can take a look at that. You can see different structures. We'll talk a little bit about those structures. Largely there are two sort of broad categories of brain tissue, right? There's what we call gray matter and white matter. Okay, when we refer to gray matter, it's this sort of darker area, these darker areas. That's simply cell bodies. Okay, the white matter, that's what we would call fiber tracts, which really are just a big collection of axons. And what do we know about axons? They're wrapped up in the myelin sheath, right? And that myelin sheath is sort of like a fatty substance, right? It's a lipid-based substance, and that's what gives it this sort of lighter or white appearance. So if you look in different planes, you'll see, here's a bunch of white matter fiber tracks. Here's a major fiber bundle. That's called the corpus callosum. That guy's actually kind of important. This is the guy that lets the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere communicate. If you have severe intractable epilepsy, they will sometimes sever this so that your convulsive seizures don't spread from one hemisphere to the other. So that's kind of a fun thing. If you know anybody who's had their corpus callosum cut, there's some cool tricks you can play on them. So that's always kind of fun, right? Because certain olfactory senses don't switch, and you can do cool things like put a partition up and show them to one side like a sign that says, hey, eat a banana, and then they'll reach out and eat a banana if you make it available on the other side. The problem is they won't know why they ate that banana because what they've read won't be communicated to the other hemisphere. You'll ask them, hey, why did you eat that banana? And they'll go, oh man, I must have been hungry, which is kind of interesting. So I start, you start to think about this is one of those epiphany moments, I think, right, in your life when you realize, wow, I can be that easily tricked into thinking I was hungry just because I was eating a banana. It's called confabulation, right? I'm going to write that word down because you guys do this all the time. All right. Confabulation is simply once you've done something or you've made some sort of decision, you make up some awesome reasons why. Right? You guys do this all the time. How many of you are, it doesn't matter, right, fans of something, just any random thing? Who likes the New England Patriots? Any hands going up on that? Great. I was going to write down who was going to fail this class. That Tom Brady's an idiot. I'm going to tell you that. I'm going to go on the record. He's an idiot. And that, shyster guru guy he's got is a total rip-off idiot. And you got to watch him. So if you're a Tom Brady fan, don't be. That's my advice to you. Your life will improve. No, him and his... So this guy claimed to be a doctor, and I'm using air quotes here, doctor. The guy has no medical credentials at all. So him and Tom Brady put their heads together, and between the two of them, they got 4 neurons firing, and they decided to make... Yeah, I'm serious. For a while, they were marketing this juice you could drink that would prevent you from getting a concussion. I know, right? Isn't that the most ridiculous thing you've ever heard of? Drink this juice, you won't get a concussion. You know what'll keep you from getting a concussion is a great offensive line. It has nothing to do with the juice you drink. I promise you. Invest a little more in your right tackle. You won't get a concussion. It has nothing to do with your with the juice you drink. So then the guy, this is another ripoff. So this is just my Tom Brady soapbox for a moment. So then he is bypassing the salary cap rules, right? Because his trainer, guru guy, whatever, is part of a company that Tom Brady owns, right? And so the Patriots hire his trainer to be their exclusive guy. He's got an office and everything, and this has been going on for years, by the way. There's some recent developments. It's going on for years, Casey. And so he gets money, and guess where that money goes? It goes right back to Tom Brady's pocket. So they're really paying Tom Brady extra money that they're not having to report on the salary cap. So it's like a total ripoff. So there you go. Concussion juice. That's the best one. They did it for a while. Yeah. I mean, they don't sell it anymore. I think somebody called the FDA got involved at some point, and they were that doesn't really work. On the other hand, I think well, if you bought it and thought it was going to work, that's on you. It's a certain point where it's buyer beware.
Concussion protection.
Yeah, really, right? It was a concussion. I stretched a little, but not much. Not enough to change the facts.
Neurosafe.
Yeah. You guys should buy some. Give it a try.
Seatbelt for your brain.
That's brilliant, isn't it?
Oh, great.
Yeah. It's just ridiculous. I don't know. What are you going to do? Hey, who in here is an alligator? No one. Just, I hope. You never know. Why is it important to know you're not an alligator? It's actually really important. There's a thing called the neuraxis, right? And for quadrupeds, hey, those are things that use 4 legs and not 2, right? You guys are bipeds, right? Because you use 2 legs. Quadrupeds are oriented differently, right? So they're oriented this way. So when we talk about, some of those directional things like caudal rostral, anterior, posterior, they are slightly shifted a little, right? Because we actually have this like 90-degree turn coming up from the spinal cord to the brain. Okay, and so while we're not going to, I don't think, ever talk about a study that uses alligators, we will talk about a study that you always got to put teeth like this, like shifty eyes. That's a really gnarly looking rat, isn't it? And it's got this like big rat tail and whiskers. We will talk about studies that have rats, and rats are also quadrupeds, even though I only drew kind of like 2 legs there. So, just to give you an idea, keep that in mind. Oh, hey, who loves meninges? They're great with cheese. I wouldn't recommend eating meninges. I mean, I don't know. Not only is your brain protected by bone, which is awesome, it's also protected by this sheath, right? And so collectively we call these the meninges. There are 3 layers. There's the dura mater, which actually means tough mother. Which is kind of cool, right? This could, if any of you are mothers and you think, wow, like I'm really tough, you could get dura mater tattooed on your body somewhere. And you just go like, watch that, I'm a tough mother. I don't know. Just things for you to do. It is actually quite tough. Have any of you ever cut through a brain before? Anybody ever sliced a brain? No? Some people have. Like some of you went to a school once that gave you a brain to cut, right? Like a sheep's brain or something. Anybody do that in high school? Yeah, right. So sometimes, was it a sheep's brain? Yeah, they're kind of small, but they're shaped like a human brain. That's why they give them to you. Sometimes there's, like in the middle, there's that tough membrane, right? That's the dura mater, just to give you an idea. And it is really tough, actually, which is good. Below that, you have the arachnoid membrane, and then you have the pia mater. What's interesting about, these two are kind of like smooth over the top, right? And your brain kind of looks like this. Okay. The pia, on the other hand, actually gets down in those folds, right, and covers the brain. It's the only one that does that. Now, there's a little bit of space in there that has some fluid in it. How many of you have heard of like subdural hematomas? Yeah. Where do you think that's located? Below the dura, right? Subdural. So that's what we're talking about there. How many of you have ever heard of an epidural? Yeah, where do you think that thing goes? Kind of, and the dura continues, actually all of the meninges continue down through the spinal cord as well, so they protect the spinal cord. So there you go, right? Things you didn't know, but now you do. Hey, everyone has to have cerebrospinal fluid. That's great. Kind of like blood plasma, right? It's in the ventricular system. We'll talk about this later. Fills that subarachnoid space. Nothing to worry about. We're not going to talk a lot about CSF, but we will as we need to. You've got some ventricles. You've got 4 ventricles. Anybody know where the second ventricle is? It's one of your other lateral ventricles. So you've got 2 lateral ventricles. They're kind of shaped like this. And then they kind of meet back here for the 3rd and then the 4th ventricle after the cerebral aqueduct. Looks just like a pair of ventricles. Hey, sometimes these guys get blocked. Now this is a continuous flow of CSF, right? It's constantly moving around, recycling, you're making new, you're filtering, right? And sometimes this will get blocked. And that's called obstructive hydrocephalus. Okay? If this happens to you, you need to get a brain valve, right? And it happens sometimes. I wouldn't worry about it like as an adult, probably. Most of the time we think about it as kids. I'll show you an image in a moment. Here are your ventricles. There are those empty spots in the middle of your brain. That's the green stuff here. Hey, who remembers Rene Descartes? These are the things that he thought were squeezing that make your arms and legs move, remember? He thought that worked on that pneumatic system. Doesn't work that way. And there's the brain valve. So what you do is you stick a big tube right into those ventricles, have a little drip tube. Now this will actually go down into the abdominal cavity. You just absorb that fluid as you would any other fluid that's in your abdominal cavity and recycle that. Okay? I like the haircut they gave this kid. They could have just bothered to, like, just to show you he had a little bit of hair, right? I don't know. Who wants to learn about development of the nervous system? Great, because I didn't want to teach you about it. So we'll talk briefly about a few important things. We're not going to spend a lot of time on this because there's so much in the development of the nervous system that's really kind of fascinating. Touching on, we're not going to be able to. Early, your nervous system really is a hollow tube, and in fact, it's basically just a hollow tube now. If you think about the ventricles, and then they really just turn right in, continuing down as a tube through the middle of your spinal cord, right? So it really is this hollow tube in the middle of your nervous system. Now the outside kind of fleshes out, so to speak, and fills out. It's going to definitely elongate. You get pockets, you get folds, you get this sort of thick portions until you finally get sort of like a brain up at the top. So here you go. This is sort of just following development there of what we call the neural plate. Okay. Not a big deal. Early in development, you sort of have these broad regions, forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain. We'll use those terms a little bit as we go along, but not a lot. Eventually, you sort of move through these developmental stages and you get what's, relatively sort of an adult brain. All of these labeled areas here, they're not really fully formed at this point. They will be fully formed when you get over here. You just kind of see what's developing and where those will appear later. We'll talk about these areas as they're important. Don't anticipate like memorizing all of this right now, right? So just kind of take your time and sit with it. This is a chart you probably never need to look at again. It just shows you a bunch of structures. So it really, if you think about this, like, why is it important that I group these structures together? Well, for your perspective, it doesn't really matter that much. If you were thinking about this in a developmental standpoint, if you were thinking about this from an evolutionary standpoint, then it might make some sense to really go back and go, wow, this species has a really well-developed telencephalon, and this species doesn't. And then that can tell us something about the history of that particular species. Since we're all humans, as far as I can tell, you never know about some people. And I don't mean that like in a negative way. Like, you really never know when you're turning into a new species, right? Because this could happen. It happened before, and it's going to happen again. You just don't know when it's going to happen. You'll know when it happens when fertility rates drop. So look for that. Because some of you are going to randomly pair, like not you individually, but some of you are randomly going to pair up with somebody else, right? And you may or may not be the same species, but you may not realize it. And what's going to happen is you may actually be able to have offspring, but those offspring will be sterile, right? That's like see, people aren't thinking about these things, but you got to watch for this. Got to watch for this. So like horses and donkeys, right? If you put a horse and a donkey together, guess what you get? It's called a mule, right? And mules, for the most part, there's like 1% of mules that are accidentally fertile, but most mules are sterile, right? And so if you accidentally turned in like to another species, and then you tried to have a kid with somebody that was still a human, you might be able to have a kid, but that kid's not going to be able to have kids. So when you see like a kind of a drop in fertility rates, go back a generation, and there you go. Nobody thinks about this stuff. This is brilliant, isn't it? And then watch for the people in the red robes and the white hats. That's when you know things are going bad. It's like a Handmaid's Tale reference there. Anybody watch that show? Anybody read the book? I'd be more impressed if you read the book. No hands. No hands. Also, Brave New World. That was one you could have. Anybody read that one? That's a shorter one. It's a shorter one. You can read that. Hey, who loves your cortex? You all should, because that's what allowed you to like put on pants today. Have you ever seen a lizard put on pants? No. It's because they don't have a cortex. They also don't have hands that can work buttons and zippers, but that's a separate story. Your cortex is going to develop over time. It's going to continue to thicken. Once you reach sort of your, that peak cortical development, you're going to have 6 plus or minus layers. We say 6 layers, but this layer 4 has like 4 layers now. I mean, there are like all these sub-layers and things. Again, because of sort of the historical perspective, when we first started looking at the cortex, it was like, oh yeah, that's 6 layers. Later, people started realizing there are sub-layers, but they didn't want to go back and change that 6-layer nomenclature, right? That system that they set up. So like, okay, so we're going to keep it 6 layers, but layer 4 is going to have like an A and a B and like a 4A alpha, whatever. So we just started adding sub-layers. You don't really need to worry about that too much. Cerebral cortex is awesome. Progenitor cells are great. These are stem cells that give rise to your central nervous system. Stem cells are great, right? If you had a bunch of cells, you go like, man, I can just turn that into anything. That's pretty sweet. And you have those early on. You still even have these as an adult, right? Like up in the olfactory epithelium. But you got to get a long pair of pliers to get those. True story. You can get them. And you can kind of reach, where the nose is, right? Reach up in there and you can pull out some cells. They seem to have some, what we would call pluripotency. They can turn into some different cell types, which is kind of cool. But they're right there up in your olfactory epithelium. Not a big deal. Some folks try to pull those out and turn them into things like dopaminergic cells, which would be awesome if you had Parkinson's disease. Problem is that doesn't really work so well. What do we know about complex brains? There are these sort of different developmental phases. Obviously, you need sort of a longer period of time, in particular what we call the asymmetrical division. Don't worry about that. Longer time for that to sort of develop, right? So neural development happens for a bit longer time. There is this interesting thing called synaptic pruning. How many of you love pomology? Nobody knows pomology. It's fruit. I'm going to write that down. So what do you do with fruit trees? You have to prune them, right? Okay. You have to trim things back, right, so that you continue to get healthy growth. We're actually going to do this in our brain. We're actually going to overproduce synapses and brain connections. And then what we'll do over time, any of those that we're not using, we're just going to clip those out, right? So how many of you have ever seen a baby? And have you ever poked a baby, like with a stick, right? So if you like poke them with a stick on the left side, their right side they do that, right? This is the baby's response to everything. And the reason for that is they've got too many of these synapses. They don't know what they're doing, right? And all these connections are mismatched. So what will happen eventually, those connections that aren't appropriate, they'll just die. They'll go through, they'll cut those out. So you actually have more synapses as an infant than you do as an adult. And you think, well, that's no good. I need more synapses. You don't. Because if you did, is what you'd still be doing all the time. Okay? So you don't want that to happen. You want to actually be able to prune, cut back, and refine what you've got going on. So that's pretty awesome. Here's a good example. This is at birth. You're going to sort of keep adding for a few years, and then you're just going to start cutting back. Okay? So that's good, right? It's easier to start out with too much and then to cut back than it is to try and navigate all of these connections, okay? Because, here's what I'm going to do for you. In this square, I'm going to draw, so watch, this is going to be impressive. I'm going to draw like all of the connections in your brain, and what I want you to do is try to pick out a single connection. So we're going to start a connection here, and then we're going to end the connection here, right? And that's going to be an important connection that's going to allow you, how many of you love wiggling your left toe? Just your left one, the left big toe. That's what this is going to let you do, okay? Now what I want you to do here in a moment is just pick out that connection. Hold on, I'm not finished. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and try to find that. What's right here? The problem is if I had, after you were given this brain, if I had to try to add that in, I would never get there, right? But if I already had a bunch of extra connections, and then I could just simply go in and start clipping out what I didn't need, and then I could be left with the connection that I did need, right? It's a much easier approach. Because sometimes when you start something here and you want it to go here, right about here it gets lost, and that's bad. But if you already have that connection and then you can just cut off that lost connection later, then you're okay, right? It's an easier, more efficient process. Don't worry too much about this. Hey, this is awesome. You start losing brain cells. Look at that. I bet you're like 17 years old. You start losing brain cells. That's fun. Good luck with that. You know, you can do things to speed this up if you want. Hey, you know what would really help you, though, to slow this down? If you were to drink some of that NeuroSafe. It's like a seatbelt for your brain. Exactly. That's what I've heard. And I bet if you had a brain injury, it'd really prevent, like, development of CTE or something, right? Yeah. Yeah, so then you probably wouldn't have that neurodegenerative issues. So there you go. I didn't talk in this class about, have you guys seen the documentary, was it Bigger, Faster, Stronger? Anybody seen, Juwan, have you seen that? It's Chris Bell, where he like hires the guys at Home Depot to start making pills for him at his house. Yeah, it's like pretty crazy, right? Hey, you got a big table at home? No, that's too bad, because I was thinking that we could just like start making, you know, because the FDA apparently doesn't check for a while. You can start making like pills. I mean, if the drink's too much, the pills might actually be a safe, you know, seatbelt for your brain, right? We could start something. How long is it?
Call it like an airbag instead of a seatbelt.
Oh, it's an airbag. That's even better, right? I think we know who's in charge of marketing that. Take a little pill. And what can we put in there? Sugar. Because, you know, actually glucose is important for brain function, right? Because if you don't have any glucose at all, your brain will shut down. So we can really make some serious claim, right? I mean, you see where we're going with this, right? You have to have, there is an essential ingredient, proprietary essential ingredient in our product that you need for proper brain function. It's an airbag for your brain. Perfect. It is great. Be a nice little project for you guys, extra credit project. That's what I should do. I think I want to do a seminar class called Projects for Your Brain. I was thinking of something more like pseudo neuroscience or something, where we just like develop these hoaxes and see if we can make money. I'd split the profits with you guys, like 70-30. It was my idea. You got to put my name on it to have some credibility. I mean, just some random student's not going to work. All right. Again, is this important? I don't know. You got a forebrain. That's the big part in the front, right? That's like saying, wow, there are states in the country. Okay. That's fun. You should go to one of those states, right? Doesn't really give you much info. Cortex is interesting. We'll talk about cortex as we need to. It's divided into some places that handle visual, auditory, somatosensory, motor commands. There are areas that integrate all of these. We'll talk about that as we get to sensory systems and motor systems, so don't worry too much about it. I mean, like, look, this is your telencephalon. All of this nice big teal area here. I mean, no one should be convinced that all of that's doing the same thing, right? Because these are all like little individual pieces that are handling different kinds of information, right? And they're all separate, and losing some of them will do different things to you, right? It's not all homogeneous. It's not all the same. Here's your diencephalon. That's interesting. That's the thalamus. And then down here's the hypothalamus. Hey, there's your pituitary gland. Who loves that? Looks like a little punching bag hanging down there, right? A little speed bag. That guy actually is important. How many of you love hormones? Great. That guy releases a lot of hormones. Okay. So that's the thing that, those hormones turned you into an adult. So that was a thrilling experience. I'm sure you all remember that fondly. Huh?
Still waiting.
Still waiting. Yeah. There's a difference between being physically and mentally adults. Yeah, this is the one that handles the physical side.
See, that was my question earlier. If I still know adults that still do this when you do things, is there a problem?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But you know how you normally learn about statistics and you think, well, like everything's a normal distribution? I don't think so. I think that one has shifted, right? And so like here are all of the and I'm just going to draw this for those, and then out here are those of us who are not doing that. So it's a small tail. It's a skewed distribution.
For sure.
Yeah. Here's that cross section again: white matter and then gray matter. Hey, this is kind of interesting. There's a thing called a sulcus. That's like a little deep wrinkle. There's a thing called a gyrus. That's a bump. If those are plural, it's sulci and gyri. Hey, what happens if you get a really big sulcus? You just call it a fissure. That's it. There you go. You guys learned something today. And no, please don't ask this or I will think horrible things about you. You do not get a new brain wrinkle every time you learn something. You ever hear people say that? That's a thing I've heard people... How many of you have heard someone say that? You can kick them in the teeth next time. Because that's like the dumbest thing ever. Like your brain is as wrinkly as it's going to be. I mean, I take that back. It'll look a little more wrinkly, but you're not getting extra wrinkles because as you get older, it'll sort of like shrivel just a little, right? Also happens while you're pregnant because your fluids are going elsewhere. That's all it is. Has nothing to do with brain function, really. I mean, when you get older, you lose some cells. That's a separate issue. But you do lose a little brain mass as you age. Yeah, there are some people who think you get an extra wrinkle, like a new wrinkle every time you learn something. It just doesn't work that way.
What's like the reasoning behind that though? Like why would they think?
Like we don't know anything about the brain, so we're just making shit up.
I think that's the reasoning
Some
there.
biology stuff.
I think it is. I think if you were to look at brains and then you would see like, well, that's a lot of wrinkles, and people know a lot, so that makes some sense. If you were to look at a rat brain, I mean that thing's like smooth, and really it's all just like olfactory bulb. It's like smooth. This is the main brain part here. So then you think, well, rats don't know anything, so they've got a smooth brain. Now, you can typically tell, like the more convoluted the cortex is, the bigger your cortex for your brain size, right? Now, Cameron, you told us that great story about the time that you chopped open the sheep brain. It had a lot of like wrinkles on it too, right? Yeah, it happens. I mean, I wouldn't say that sheep are in like the top category of intelligence, but they are a mammal, so they beat out pretty much anything that's not a mammal, because mammals are kind of smarter than non-mammals. So it beats out turtles just outright, no contest there. But when it comes to other mammals, sheep are... Well, there's a reason you call people who like can't make their own decisions sheep. It's because sheep aren't that bright. But they have wrinkly brains. So there you go. Yeah, I really have no idea the origin of that, but I've heard that and a lot of other people have. So it's not like a... There's also, here's this one. You only use like 10% of your brain. Yeah, that's totally wrong. If you use 10% of your brain, you're dead. like literally you're dead, because you need more than 10% of your brain to keep your heart beating. I mean, and breathing, right? And that's like this guy down here. Now, you don't want to use 100% of your brain at any given time, then that just gives you a seizure. So you kind of want to avoid that. But your brain's always doing stuff everywhere, right? Remember when we talked about that resting membrane potential and we said you're never there? You're just going up and down. I thought, you're doing stuff, right? There's not like some part of your brain like, man, I'm just saving that part for later. Dad keeps telling me one of these days. No, you've been using it. They all have their own job, right? That's what I'm telling you. This is not all just one big lump of homogeneous tissue, and you can just like randomly start using extra parts of it. It's all divvied up from the beginning to do stuff, right? Some of it's controlling your foot. Some of it's controlling your heartbeat. Some of it's helping you judge distance between two objects, right? It's all doing stuff. It's got its own specialized job, okay? Now, we're not going to learn all of those parts and all of the specialized jobs, but we're going to learn some of them. The ones that we don't learn about it, don't think it's just like empty space. It's doing something else you don't need to know about right now. That one gets me too. Like, who would really think you're only using 10% of your brain? Like, that's just not even efficient. Like, if you're only using 10% of your brain, why don't you let me put an extra liver up there in the other 90% or something I might use, right? It's just, it's not going to work that way. Nature doesn't work that way. If you've got it, you're using it. If you're not using it, guess what happens? You don't have it.
How do you feel about the Scarlett Johansson Lucy movie? Like, they were
So,
about to unlock it.
so I was going to say, I caught that movie on PBS, and I accidentally started it in the middle, and I was totally lost. And then I was like, I'm just going to turn it off. And I'm like, if I'm going to watch a Scarlett Johansson movie, I'm going to watch something else. I mean, that was just, like, I'll watch The Prestige or the what was that other movie she was in? The Other Boleyn Sister, maybe. I might watch that one. I might go back and watch Avengers. Just, you know, that one probably had more accurate science in it. It's cool. You know, nobody else can pick up this hammer, and that's got better physics in it than they put in that Lucy movie, I think. I don't know. That's my take on it from like the half I saw on TBS.
It's not about it.
Yeah. I think I went and ate a burrito or something. I was like, forget this.
Better than watching that movie.
Yeah. I've got a movie rating system. Like, I would pay for it in a theater. I would rent it, you know, because there are like some renting services, right? And then there's the other one, like, I wouldn't even watch it if it was on TBS for free. So that one might have been in that category. So there you go. There are all kinds of other movies out there that are not terribly accurate. That's a whole other special topics class you could do, right? Like neuroscience in the movies. We used to, when I was in grad school, we would like meet at this establishment, and we would watch movies and converse about things in the movies that weren't accurate, related to neuroscience. You got lobes. Again, okay, so lobes were getting a little more useful. Okay, we're not super useful, but a little more useful. You've got an occipital lobe. Most of that's going to be like your visual cortex and stuff. You got temporal lobe. A lot of that's going to be related to language, like auditory things. You've got a frontal cortex or frontal lobe. That's going to have a lot of your higher advanced thinking kind of stuff in it. What you don't see here is the parietal lobe, which is sort of back in this area. That's a lot of sensory area as well, a lot of sensory integration area where you're going to integrate visual and auditory, motor things, right? So it's sort of these overlap association areas. Not a big deal. This is kind of interesting. I mean, this is your primary somatosensory, which involves senses of your body and your motor cortex. We'll talk about that in detail when we get to there, but just to kind of give you some idea about things. Talked about this stuff, motor control. Lots of stuff controls motor function. You would think that's something pretty simple, but it's actually something complex. It's not just about like doing things, but it's about the calculation before you do it, right? Like how, you don't think about this so much, and you're thinking like, so Riley, you've got a long distance to walk, longer than some people to get out of here. But you're going to have to plan that, right? You're not like, maybe you are right now because you're not really interested in what I'm saying, but let's imagine you're really deeply engrossed in this content instead. But when it's time for you to leave, you really are going to think of, you're really going to plan this, right? I mean, you're not, it's not going to maybe reach conscious awareness, but there's a lot of planning going on to get you down those steps and out the door, right? How many of you love robots? Yeah, robots are awesome, right? Do you know why they're having like difficulty getting a robot to walk? Because walking is one of the most complicated things you'll ever do, right? You don't think about it, but walking is very complicated. Staying balanced, making sure you don't step in a hole, right? Making sure you don't walk into a wall. These are very complicated things, right? The other one is like, you know how much time they spend calculating? Like they do this too. Like, how many of you, where were the baseball fans? We had some baseball fans before, right? No? Nobody's a baseball fan? So one of the most complicated things to do in baseball, believe it or not, other than hit the ball, is like catch a fly ball, right? And like decide like what path you should run to catch that fly ball. And training a robot, like programming a robot to catch a ball, is surprisingly difficult, right? Something most people can do quite easily. If I had a ball, and I wish I did now, I would throw it at someone, and then I would hope you could catch it, right? I mean, it's a thing you do every single, well, maybe not every single day, but you do on a regular basis. But getting a robot to do that's quite complicated, because look at all of this brain space that's going to be involved in making those calculations, judging time and distance and speed, and it's really quite complicated. Making adjustments on the fly, right? Celine, if you over adjust and then you have to come back, right, to try to correct your path, it really becomes a complicated thing to do. If you could teach a robot to do that, you guys will be flying. Because that'd be the next thing you do, is teach a robot to fly. Here's some fiber tracks. There's this thing called diffusion tensor imaging. Don't worry about it too much. Nothing that's really going to affect your life greatly. Here's somebody that had their head cut in half. That's not too important either. All right, let's talk briefly and broadly about some brain regions. Again, we're going to hit these in detail when we need to, okay? So here's the limbic system. If we talk about the limbic system, we're really talking about things involved primarily with like learning and memory, okay? So we have limbic cortex, cingulate gyrus, whatever. Hippocampus, that's a guy we'll spend a lot of time talking about. The hippocampus, that's involved in consolidation of memory, not memory storage. We'll talk about that more in detail. So there's a lot of information flying your way right now, right? And that's going to kind of be in your hippocampus for a while. You're going to consolidate that, store that somewhere safe, and then be able to collect more info and do that, right? The amygdala is involved. That's really the fear center, right? Monkeys that don't have an amygdala, they'll just go randomly bite off fingers of other monkeys because they don't really care what the consequences are, right? That happens sometimes anyway. Like, you know, your alpha monkey will attack the lower monkeys. That's no big deal. But if you take one of those bottom-ranking monkeys and take out its amygdala, it'll just start attacking whoever. So you got to watch out for that. Here you go. Here's a picture. Some of the other structures we skipped over, they're not too important. Here's your amygdala, your hippocampus. Why is it called the hippocampus? They say it looks like a seahorse, in case you wanted to know. Hippo is for a horse, like hippodrome. Anybody ever been to a hippodrome? You've been to a hippodrome? Okay, well, that's surprising. Huh? In Greece? Oh, okay. There aren't a lot of hippodromes in it, like locally, right, for you to go to. But it's like a dome for horse racing, right?
Yeah, it's a short track, honestly.
Yep.
If you knew Martinsville speed track, NASCAR was the same way.
There you go. Right? That's a. I was going to try to come up with a fancy word for that. It's the same thing. Specifically, this is for horses because it starts with hippo. That's how you know. Basal ganglia are kind of important. We'll talk a lot about the basal ganglia later. A lot of motor movement. Think about disorders like Parkinson's disease, Huntington's disease. Interestingly, not Alzheimer's, I'm sorry, autism spectrum disorder, OCD, Tourette's, all of those seem to involve the basal ganglia as well. If you think about sort of the repetitive stereotyped movements of those disorders, right? Tourette's, you kind of have those uncontrollable tics. With autism, a lot of times you'll see individuals with autism, they'll continue to make the same movements over and over. They'll kind of rock back and forth sometimes when they speak with you. Again, that's a repetitive movement. And of course, OCD, the obsession, the compulsion, yes, right, that action, right, whatever the action is that you're taking. So like, oh man, I'm afraid I'm going to get germs all over me, so I'm going to wash my hands. It's that continual ritualized motion and that movement. So that's why you're going to have your basal ganglia involved as well. So that's kind of cool, right? I don't know if anybody's excited about that. Here's that diencephalon. Casey, I know you've been waiting on this because I told you you had an awesome diencephalon, and as a species we do, that's great, but it's like thalamus and hypothalamus. Again, the thalamus is mostly going to be involved in sensory systems, but that still doesn't really tell us much, right, Cindy? Because, like, how many sensory systems do you have? A bunch, right? And a lot of them are going through the thalamus. So, wow, your thalamus is screwed up. Well, okay. Does that mean I can't see? Does that mean I can't hear? Am I having trouble feeling pain? You know, what is the issue, right? That still doesn't really tell me everything. And the hypothalamus, geez, I mean, this guy really is going to be hormonal control. Think about circadian rhythms. Those kinds of things, a lot of that's going to come out of your hypothalamus. Hypothalamus will tell you when it's daylight and you need to be out moving around, when it's dark and you need to go to sleep, right? We'll do cool stuff like that. We'll talk about some specific nuclei within the hypothalamus and the thalamus as we get there. And there's your thalamus and your hypothalamus, and right around that's the basal ganglia, so you can kind of see where that goes in the middle. Thalamus means like inner chamber or something in Latin, so it's kind of inside there. The hypothalamus, again, it's important for the 4 F's, fighting, fleeing, feeding, and reproducing. A lot of that's going to be related to survival if you think about that. Some folks have a little connection there between either of their thalamic nuclei. Not everybody's got one of those. Sorry if you don't. Doesn't make a difference, I don't think. Tectum, tegmentum, we're not going to worry about that. We might talk a little bit about the superior and the inferior colliculus. Colliculus just means little hill. So like 2 of those. Those are involved in some sensory systems. Your superior colliculus is going to help with like visual responses, right? It's going to help, and the inferior colliculus is going to be auditory, so it's going to be some integration, right? How many of you have ever heard a noise and you turned your head to look at it? Yeah, that happens, right, Sarah? I mean, that happens all the time. That's going to involve your superior colliculus, so it's kind of an important thing. What about the tegmentum? Not a lot. Here's going to be too important. The substantia nigra is important. The what we call the nigrostriatal pathway. That's the projection from the substantia nigra to the striatum. This is the guy that falls out on you when you have Parkinson's disease, right? The dopaminergic neurons, they're dopaminergic neurons here, and they die. So then you lose your dopamine neurons in that pathway, and you lose the ability to control your motions, your movements. Hey, who loves their cerebellum? This is great for like coordination. Have you ever done something and then wanted to know that you did it? Cerebellum's really great for that. How many of you have ever, you've just been like walking along, really been paying attention, and then all of a sudden you like step through the floor, right? You step and you've like, there's a step you weren't anticipating, there's a hole you weren't anticipating, right? And you stepped and you went just a little too far, but you caught yourself before you just went face first all the way down the stairs. Your cerebellum was important for that. It's the guy who's checking, okay, my foot should have hit solid ground at this point. When it didn't, the cerebellum goes, uh-oh, then you got to pull back, right? So you don't fall down. So cerebellum's really important for that. Cerebellum is one of the first places to be affected by alcohol, right? I think there's this inverse relationship between how coordinated you think you are and how coordinated you actually are when you're drinking, right? So when people are drinking, they always think, right, that their athletic prowess is just massively increased. Like, yeah, I can jump that. That's no problem. Watch this. And in fact, you should probably just be on the couch, right? That's the coordination that you have. Sit on the couch. These other guys are important. Your pons, your medulla oblongata, the rest of the hindbrain, or what we might call your brain stem. These are important. They're going to regulate things like blood pressure, heart rate, respiration, those things that keep you alive. Okay, there are going to be some other stuff down there, pupillary reflexes, fun stuff like that. There you go. There's cerebellum. There's brainstem. Hey, what happens after the brainstem? Anybody know what's next? That's the spinal cord. It's all continuous. How do you know you're in the spinal cord? There's a sign. And it just says like spinal cord 500 millimeters. Because we measure things in millimeters. We're not going to do it in miles. That's not really what happens. There's a difference in the structure and the shape. When you get out of the brain stem, you lose some of these brain regions, and then you just have spinal cord. All right, so there's your spinal cord. I'm not going to ask you a whole lot about this. You've got your different vertebra. Maybe they're important, maybe they're not. Behaviorally, they're not going to be so important, so we're not going to think about it a lot, right? So, yeah, you got, however many cervical or thoracic. That's something you probably should know for another class. I'm not going to ask you a lot about it here. This is your spinal cord. It is important to think about this as a two-way street, right? So what's in blue here is what we call ascending tracks. So blue is what we might think of as sensory, right? So that's taking information up to your brain. And then the red is going to be descending, so we might think about that as motor. Those are the pathways that are carrying the signals down to let your body do the things that it should based on the information that went up. We're going to do some action when it comes down. Remember, we have input. I'm going to draw the brain up here. That's where we're doing our calculation. And then we have output. It's that three-step system I gave you a couple weeks ago. Works perfectly right here. What do you need to know about cranial nerves? You have cranial nerves. They reach out to things mostly in the head and neck region, with the exception really of the vagus nerve. That reaches out to slot machines. That's vagus, V-A-G-U-S. Really, that goes everywhere. This is why sometimes you will have weird responses to stimulation in certain parts of your body, because the vagus nerve sort of connects everything, right? Heart, lungs, a lot of your abdominal organs, things like that. Some cranial nerves are, only carrying sensory information. Some sensory and motor. That's not really going to be too important. This isn't so important either. You do have, we do want to think about your autonomic nervous system, though, right? We're going to talk about this briefly. You have a parasympathetic and a sympathetic division of the nervous system, the autonomic nervous system. Sometimes it's a little tricky to tell the two apart. In general, your sympathetic nervous system is going to get you revved up, and your parasympathetic nervous system is going to bring you back down, right? That's really what you want to think about. Quite often they're going to contact the same sort of places, right? So again, the sympathetic is going to be arousal and energy expenditure, whereas the parasympathetic is going to be more in that relaxed state. It's going to sort of bring you back down. I love this one. It's just going straight up that guy's nose, right? Those are your cranial nerves. You've got like 12 pair of these. Not anything to worry about, okay? They go to different parts again. As I said, mostly head and neck. But you do have that vagus nerve that goes down. By the way, vagus, in this case, is from the same word as vagrant. Right? This is when you wander the streets aimlessly without money. And the vagus nerve kind of wanders your body aimlessly. Sort of goes everywhere. Okay. There's your spinal cord. If you need to know, stuff comes off, stuff comes back on. The exact shape of this is going to change as you go up and down your spinal cord. The reason for that is you're getting more motor pathways and have fewer sensory pathways up and down. It's not a big deal for you to worry about for this class. How about that? That was like a whole chapter right there. Hey, don't worry, folks. There's more to come.